Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we want to thank you so much for bringing us here together safely. We lift up those who couldn't be here with us today. And God, we just ask that your Holy Spirit may be felt today during this divine hour. Bless each family and thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. You can remain standing. Stand where our opening song is found in hymnal page 567. 567, have that one,
Sabbath morning, and thank you for gathering us here all. And we, Lord, we ask you to bless this offering, and this name we pray. Amen. Children, it's time for children's story to pray with us. Pray with us, story.
Good morning, children.
Good morning.
Happy Sabbath. And how are all you today? 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, it's not the biggest crowd I ever seen, but it's an outstanding crowd. Oh, I forgot to wear in. Now, you know, I'm not really prepared for this. You wouldn't believe how unprepared I am. When was the last holiday or day of whatever? Anybody remember? Do you remember? Oh, what was it? Oh, that's right, it was Halloween. What's coming up next? Yeah, what? Thanksgiving? You're right. Thanksgiving. When did they start Thanksgiving? Long time ago, right? Well, it was these people that they called them pilgrims. Anybody ever heard of pilgrims? Yeah. All right, they come over from probably England, maybe, or the Netherlands or someplace. And they landed in Virginia and some points north. And they had a lot of trouble, and they got to be friends with Indians. And the Indians taught them how to plant corn in this area and this and that and the other. So this one fall had a great harvest, so they decided to celebrate and invite their Indian friends, and they would have a big dinner. And that was the first Thanksgiving. They had a big dinner to celebrate their great harvest. So we have Thanksgiving whether we have a good harvest or not. Okay? Now, it's a kind of interesting. Turkeys are a great theme of Thanksgiving. Why are turkeys such a big theme of Thanksgiving? Why? You know? Well, I'm going to tell you something. They had turkeys in this country when all the pilgrims got here. They were wild turkeys. They were all over. And people ate them. And they ate them so much they became extinct. But not all over the country, just on the east. Now, if you come out to my place any day of the week, you're going to see turkeys all over. There are tons of turkeys out there. Yeah, sometimes there's 25 at a time in my front yard, or just south of the house. They're there all the time, and they are the symbol of Thanksgiving, turkeys. Now, I've ate a couple of them turkeys, those native turkeys. They have awful dark meat, but they don't taste that bad, you know. And but they are the symbol of Thanksgiving, and they are all over out there. Now, they weren't always out there. When I moved out there were no turkeys. I moved out there in 1970. That was a long time ago. Well, in about 1980, I thought, we ain't got nothing to shoot at out here. So I bought a whole bunch of wild turkeys and turned them loose. I had no idea they would multiply the way they did. Now they have wild turkeys over the whole countryside, and there are people out there that cuss the day of my birth because of the turkeys. But I kind of like them. I think they're neat. And they're the symbol of Thanksgiving. So I can look out the window any day of the week and think, there's the symbol of Thanksgiving. They're beautiful birds, and they're big, and they roost in trees, and they can fly pretty good if they're up high. They can fly, and every night they fly up into a tree, and that's where they spend the night. And they fly around a little bit, but mostly they walk and they run. They can run like nothing you've ever seen. You can't believe how fast a turkey can run and fly. But mostly they just kind of walk along and they eat here and there and whatever's handy. And when we think of Thanksgiving, we always think of turkeys. And if you ever want to see a lot of turkeys, you come to my place and I'll show you just about any day of the week. All the turkeys you want to see. They're beautiful.
Those turkeys come out of the hill today, if they noticed.
They did? Oh yeah, we got some out here too. You ever notice the ones out here? We don't have so many, but we got some. I should catch a bunch of mine and bring them in here.
Oh, no, you don't. No, you don't.
Oh yeah.
No.
Some people think they have some bad habits. I don't. But some people do. Sometimes we have to scrape away in front of the door because of the turkeys, but that's good exercise for us. So when we think of Thanksgiving, think of turkeys. And think of our forefathers who come here all those years ago and landed in this area where there wasn't any white people. All we had was Indians. And the Indians welcomed everybody that came in those early days. And the first Thanksgiving, you had the people from England and the Netherlands who were Caucasians. Then you had the American Indians, and they had a big celebration. So think of that when you're eating Thanksgiving dinner, how it was in the beginning. It was really great. And that today is my story.
This morning our scripture reading is Proverbs 15, 31 through 33. Proverbs 15, 31 through 33. The ear that heareth the reproof of life abideth among the wise. He that refuses instruction despises his own soul, but he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Anybody have any prayer requests or praises or anything?
We'll take a minute just to bow our heads. Anyone that can kneel, please do so. Dear Lord, we come to you today. We ask that your Holy Spirit would be in this sanctuary. And Lord, we know there's people that couldn't make it because of health reasons and other reasons, Lord. We pray that you would give them a special blessing. We pray, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would be with each one of them. And Lord, I know there's unspoken prayer requests here in this room. And I pray, Lord, whatever those requests are, that if you can grant them, that you would do so. And Lord, we know that you love us each one. And we pray that you will take care of us each one. And Lord, please bless this service. And please bless our pastor and his family. Give him a special blessing today and be with him each day. We ask these things in your holy and precious name, Lord. Amen.
Good morning, church family. Good morning. Happy Sabbath. Let's try that once more. Happy Sabbath. God is good. And all the time. Let's try the next one. God is great. Almost. Let's try it. When I say God is great, then you're supposed to reply what? You better tell somebody. I know I only come here twice a month. But when I say God is great, you're supposed to reply, you better tell somebody. And then when I say you better tell somebody, you reply, God is great. Let's try that. God is great. You better tell somebody. Amen. Well, I see we didn't have a special music, so maybe I'll just share a song with you guys really quick. I just hope that you're blessed by this song. May each moment of each hour, and if you know, sing along, of each day of your lives be a picture of love to all the world. And in Jesus, may you grow, may you trust Him, may you know of His love, and His love may know you, and soon He shall come. May we all join as one in the love that we share in His glory. This is our prayer. Please bow your heads with me as I have an added word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, Lord, here are your youth, here are your children, here are our grandmothers and our grandfathers, our aunties, our uncles, our mothers, our fathers, and God, you love each of us, and today's title of the message is to listen carefully I just pray a special blessing upon each and every person here, Lord, today, that we may be more than just doers, but hearers of your word. Help us to listen carefully to what you have to say to us today is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Listen carefully. I don't want you all to be confused with today's sermon, which was read already to you in Proverbs 15, verses 31 through 33. But I use this passage as a springboard for me to make three specific suggestions in which I will make from other passages in the Bible. So I want you guys to turn with me once again in your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 15. Proverbs chapter 15, verses 31 through 33. Now today's message might not be long, that's why it's titled to listen carefully, right? So you guys bear with me as we read the passage in the Bible. Proverbs chapter 15, verses 31 through 33, and it reads, "Whoever heeds life-giving correction will be at home amongst the who?" Let's hear that once more. Amongst the who? The wise. Verse 32, "Those who disregard this discipline despise themselves, but the one who heeds correction gains understanding." Verse 33, "Wisdom's instruction is to fear the Lord, and humility comes before what? Humility comes before what? Honor." Sioux City Church family and friends, let me share with you a little history and culture of a tiny country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where my parents come from. This country is known as the Kingdom of Tonga, and it's a little speck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right in the middle. And there are three different social classes of people in the Kingdom of Tonga. There are the commoners, that's the first group, and then there's a second group, which we call the noble people, and then there's a third group, which we call the royal family. And when interacting with the different classes of people, there are certain protocols that are to take place. You see, the way you sit, the type of clothing you wear, and even the way that you walk. Even the way that you walk when in the presence, even when you're in the presence of the king and queen, there are many rules that take place when visiting the royal family or the king and queen. Let's use one example. Let's use language. A simple word that we use here in America or in the English language to communicate to these three kinds of social classes that I just mentioned to you. The word eat. How many of you guys like to eat? Can I hear an amen? Amen. The word eat. If we talk to a commoner in Tonga, you would say the word kai. Now, can you guys try that with me? Kai. Repeat after me. Kai.
Kai.
That's it. And to a noble, you would say ilo. Can you guys say that?
Ilo.
Ilo. I-L-O, or however you pronounce it. Ilo. And if you were to speak to the king or queen, you would not use the word kai, and you would not even use the word ilo, but instead you would use this word, and I want you to repeat after me. Tau mafa. Tau mafa. Yeah, tau mafa. So that's how you would pronounce it. You see, this tiny island, the Kingdom of Tonga, is the last monarchy that exists in the South Pacific Islands. And there is a high level of respect for the royal family. The traditions of the Tongan people are taken very seriously when dealing with the customs that take place amongst the palace. And one of the most highly revered rulers of Tonga was the Queen of Salute. And the Queen of Salute, she won the hearts of all of her people during the 47th year reign, her 47th year reign. You see, Queen Salote brought Tonga to international attention when during her sole visit to Europe, she attended the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in London. You see, during the coronation procession, it began to rain, and hoods were placed on the carriages in the procession. And as Tongan custom dictates that one should not imitate the actions of the person one is honoring. You see, she refused to put a hood on her carriage, and she rode through the pouring rain in an open carriage. It is interesting when you dissect the different levels of interaction between commoners and royals to see this Queen of Tonga humble herself during Queen Elizabeth's coronation. This was an unforgettable moment for the people in England. This was an unforgettable time for the Tongan people. And it brought a common ground to all, showing that regardless of status, we are all the same. Can I hear an amen? Humility. Humility. How would you define it? Why should humility be so important to every Christian believer? You see, for those of you who've read C.S. Lewis, he says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. When we look at this story of Queen Salote, it is mind-boggling to me to think that a woman of such high respect, in which a commoner would have to crawl on their hands, to crawl on their knees, just to be in her presence, would humble herself to show respect during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And when we read Proverbs 31, verse 33, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility." Solomon in the Bible, he wrote his portion of Proverbs in his early years when he was still faithful and still obedient to God. And when we look at this book of Proverbs of Solomon, we see the importance of living a life dedicated to decisions that will benefit the Christian in living a life that will be set heaven-bound. Solomon was a major influence because of the way he glorified God. This is what made Solomon so impactful at such a young age. He chose to seek God's wisdom above everything. Family and friends, don't stop seeking God's wisdom, and don't stop glorifying God in all that you do. Amen? The well-known story of Solomon. We all understand that he could have asked God for anything, but instead he asked God for wisdom. Because God was pleased with Solomon's request for wisdom, God also granted him riches. God also granted him power. But as Solomon's popularity and riches rose with his name, he became distracted by his own accomplishments that he lost sight of God and God's plan for his people. Do you remember when Solomon built the temple? He prayed in 1 Kings 8, verse 43. This was his prayer in 1 Kings 8, verse 43. He says, "They shall hear of thy great name and of thy strong hand, that they may know that this house which I have built is called by thy name." You see, in the beginning, Solomon walked closely with the Lord. And when the Queen of Sheba visited, she was astonished by Solomon's wisdom. The work he was doing in his kingdom, that she was constrained not to exalt him or any other, but instead she exalted God, who had given Solomon the wisdom. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 9, 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 9, "Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighted in thee, to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice." This impression was left on many influential people who crossed paths with King Solomon in the beginning of his reign. However, as time had passed, Solomon fell into the temptation of self-exaltation and promotion, that he began to take praise that belonged to God for himself. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the impact Solomon could have had on a larger scale if he continued to seek God's wisdom and humility? Church family, Sioux City Church, it is impossible to have God's wisdom if you are not willing to allow God to humble you. Wisdom and humility, they go hand in hand. Of course, Solomon is known for his virtues. He received the virtues and the characteristics that he received from God. However, don't forget that the Bible records his downfall. He was at a high point of his life, and instead of pointing others to God, he chose to claim credit for himself. That's why today, the temple that was built for Jehovah is still referred to as Solomon's temple. And looking at the life of Solomon, there are 3 lessons that we can draw from in regard to humility and wisdom. And the first point I want to make is that we need to listen. What was the first one? It's just one word. It's to what? It's to listen. And in the book of Proverbs chapter 19, verses 20, it says, "Listen to advice and accept instructions, that you may gain wisdom in the future." You see, listening is an important key factor in communication. And I know you all know that wherever you work and even school, everything that you do, we need to know the art of listening. Opening oneself to hearing the advice of godly counsel and instruction will increase one's discernment. And as humans, we often do not want to listen, right? We want to do what pleases us. And however, listening is key when it comes to walk with God. You all remember the old saying that goes, God gave us 2 ears, right? And 1 mouth. So we ought to listen twice as much as we speak. Amen? I didn't hear an amen. Amen, church family? I just want to make sure you all are listening. So what was our key word for point number 1? Is to what?
Listen.
It's to listen. Now we'll go into our point number 2. So listen carefully. It's to reflect. What is it? It's to reflect. Taking time to understand criticism about your own actions is not easy. Oftentimes it is hard to hear what others have to say about what you are doing. But in Job, you can turn your Bibles, Job chapter 5, verse 17. Job chapter 5, verse 17, it says, "Behold, how happy is the man who God reproves. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty." When you look at the Bible, there are many characters who were rebuked. Let's look at Saul. Saul was rebuked for the decision he made when going to war. What about Moses? Moses was rebuked for hitting the rock. What about Peter? Peter was rebuked when boasting that he would follow Jesus no matter what. Had Solomon heeded to the rebuke that had come from the counsel given by those who were godly, he would have accomplished so much more for the Lord. Which brings us to our last point. So wake up, church family. Our last point is here. I want you to repeat after me after I say this long phrase. To take your relationship with God serious. What was it?
Take your relationship with God serious.
So what was point number 1?
Listen.
Point number 2? And point number 3? To take your relationship with God seriously, right? In other words, do not be afraid of the Lord, but reverence God. In the book of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, I'll wait a little bit for those of you who are turning there. 1 Peter 5, verse 5, it says, submit yourselves to your elders, submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. You see, understanding that all things come from the Lord, and the Lord alone puts into perspective that all of the glory and honor doesn't belong to you, doesn't belong to me, doesn't belong to the person next to you, but it belongs to God. This is important in God's work. This is important within God's body, His ministry. And as a pastor of this Sioux City and Spencer Church, this two-church district, I realize that my role is not to be a dictator, but instead my role is simply to be a servant leader for each of you. And church family, we are all called by God to be servant leaders. It is not our job to climb upon the throne of God to do His job. Family and friends, I pray we all may be reminded that there is only one person who sits that high, and that is God Himself. Amen. In the book of James chapter 1 verse 5, James chapter 1 verse 5, it says, the God whom we serve is no respecter of persons. He who gave to Solomon the spirit of wise discernment is willing to impart the same blessing to His children today. If any of you lack wisdom, His word declares, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. God and His heavenly hosts are working alongside God's faithful workers, church family. And if we choose to be a part of God's army, we are connecting ourselves to the source of strength that will empower us to be a blessing unto others. Family and friends, as we draw near to the end of another year, to another Thanksgiving, to another Christmas, we need not be distracted. We need to stay focused. We need to listen. We need to reflect. And we need to take our relationships with God seriously. If you agree with me, can I hear an amen?
Amen.
And at this moment, like I said, this message isn't too long, but it's just straight to the point. That's why it's titled to listen carefully. I just want to invite our piano player to come down as we get ready to sing the same song that we sang earlier in our hymn. Nancy, thanks. And for our deacons and elders, if you guys could please come forward. We're going to sing this song, and afterwards, you guys heard in the beginning of the service, we have our elders and our deacons coming down. They'll be here down front after I close with the word of prayer. If that's your prayer, and you need a prayer, you have a hard and a tough week, or you need some reassurance that God is by your side, these deacons and elders and myself will be here after prayer to pray with anyone that needs a prayer. But let's go ahead and sing our song, which goes together with today's sermon, which is for any of our youth, can we get a raise hand of all our youth, and even young adults, if you're a youth or young adult, can you raise your hand? I see you guys. Can you guys please come forward over here? We'll meet here at the end. Can you guys come now? All the youth, the whole section, any of the youth, the young adults. Hey, you guys can all just come over here. And I just wanted to say a prayer with you guys too also. If you're a youth, if you like to, you know. All right, let us pray. And please, afterwards, if you guys can all remain quiet for those who want to come forward to pray, that would be appreciated. Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we want to thank you so much for each person here. God, I pray a special blessing upon those who could be with us here today. We continue lifting up Linda to you, who's continuing to go through her developing stages after surgery. We thank you, Lord, that Nancy's here with us. And God, a lot of us have had long work weeks. I just pray strength for each individual who just needs the energy, Lord, to continue throughout this next week. We thank you for our youth and our young adults and our leaders, youth leaders, and for everyone in this church, God. I just want to thank you. Be with us as we fellowship now, and as we go throughout the remaining of these Sabbath hours. Thank you for our elders and our leaders of the church. Help us, Lord, to listen carefully. Help us, Lord, to reflect and not to be quick to look down on others. That's not our job, Lord. And help us each to take our relationship with you seriously. Is our prayer in God's name, in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.